Chapter 1 The Cold War Era. Chapter 2 The End of Bipolarity. Chapter 1 The Cold War Era. Content. Contemporary World Politics. Contents. Chapter 1 The Cold War Era. Chapter 2 The End of Bipolarity. Chapter 3 is Hegemony in World Politics. Chapter 4 Alternative Centers of Power. Chapter 5 Contemporary South Asia. Chapter 6 International Organizations. Chapter 7 Security in the Contemporary World. Chapter 8 Environment and Natural Resources. Chapter 9 Globalization. Chapter 1 The Cold War Era. Overview. This chapter provides a backdrop to the entire book. The end of the Cold War is usually seen as the beginning of the contemporary era in world politics, which is the subject matter of this book. It is, therefore, appropriate that we begin the story with a discussion of the Cold War. The chapter shows how the dominance of two superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, was central to the Cold War. It tracks the various arenas of the Cold War in different parts of the world. The chapter views the non-aligned movement (NAM) as a challenge to the dominance of the two superpowers and describes the attempts by the non-aligned countries to establish a new international economic order (NIEO) as a means of attaining economic development and political independence. It concludes with an assessment of India's role in NAM and asks how successful the policy of non-alignment has been in protecting India's interests. Cuban Missile Crisis. In April 1961, the leaders of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, were worried that the United States of America, USA, would invade communist-ruled Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro, the president of the small island nation off the coast of the United States. Cuba was an ally of the Soviet Union and received both diplomatic and financial aid from it. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, decided to convert Cuba into a Russian base. In 1962, he placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The installation of these weapons put the US, for the first time, under fire from close range and nearly doubled the number of bases or cities in the American mainland which could be threatened by the USSR. 3 weeks after the Soviet Union had placed the nuclear weapons in Cuba, the Americans became aware of it. The US President, John F. Kennedy, and his advisors were reluctant to do anything that might lead to full-scale nuclear war between the two countries, but they were determined to get Khrushchev to remove the missiles and nuclear weapons from Cuba. Kennedy ordered American warships to intercept any Soviet ships heading to Cuba as a way of warning the USSR of his seriousness. A clash seemed imminent in what came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The prospects of this clash made the whole world nervous, for it would have been no ordinary war. Eventually, to the world's great relief, both sides decided to avoid war. The Soviet ships slowed down and turned back. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a high point of what came to be known as the Cold War. The Cold War referred to the competition, the tensions and a series of confrontations between the United States and Soviet Union, backed by their respective allies. Fortunately, however, it never escalated into a hot war, that is, a full-scale war between these two powers. There were wars in various regions, with the two powers and their allies involved in warfare and in supporting regional allies, but at least the world avoided another global war. The Cold War was not simply a matter of power rivalries, of military alliances, and of the balance of power. These were accompanied by a real ideological conflict as well, a difference over the best and the most appropriate way of organizing political, economic, and social life all over the world. The Western Alliance, headed by the US, represented the ideology of liberal democracy and capitalism, while the Eastern Alliance, headed by the Soviet Union, was committed to the ideology of socialism and communism. You have already studied these ideologies in Class Xi. What is the Cold War? The end of the Second World War is a landmark in contemporary world politics. In 1945, the Allied forces, led by the US, Soviet Union, Britain and France defeated the Axis powers led by Germany, Italy and Japan, ending the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. The war had involved almost all the major powers of the world and spread out to regions outside Europe including Southeast Asia, China, Burma, now Myanmar, and parts of India's northeast. The war devastated the world in terms of loss of human lives and civilian property. The First World War had earlier shaken the world between 1914 and 1918. End of the Second World War was also the beginning of the Cold War. The World War ended when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, causing Japan to surrender. Critics of the US decision to drop the bombs have argued that the US knew that Japan was about to surrender and that it was unnecessary to drop the bombs. They suggest that the US action was intended to stop the Soviet Union from making military and political gains in Asia and elsewhere and to show Moscow that the United States was supreme. As supporters have argued that the dropping of the atomic bombs was necessary to end the war quickly and to stop further loss of American and Allied lives. Whatever the motives, the consequence of the end of the Second World War was the rise of 2 new powers on the global stage. With the defeat of Germany and Japan, the devastation of Europe and in many other parts of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union became the greatest powers in the world with the ability to influence events anywhere on Earth. While the Cold War was an outcome of the emergence of the US and the USSR as 2 superpowers rival to each other, it was also rooted in the understanding that the destruction caused by the use of atom bombs is too costly for any country to bear. The logic is simple yet powerful. When 2 rival powers are in possession of nuclear weapons capable of inflicting death and destruction unacceptable to each other, a full-fledged war is unlikely. In spite of provocations, neither side would want to risk war since no political gains would justify the destruction of their societies. In the event of a nuclear war, both sides will be so badly harmed that it will be impossible to declare one side or the other as the winner. Even if one of them tries to attack and disable the nuclear weapons of its rival, the other would still be left with enough nuclear weapons to inflict unacceptable destruction. This is called the logic of deterrence. Both sides have the capacity to retaliate against an attack and to cause so much destruction that neither can afford to initiate war. Thus, the Cold War, in spite of being an intense form of rivalry between great powers, remained a cold and not hot or shooting war. The deterrence relationship prevents war but not the rivalry between powers. Note the main military features of the Cold War. The 2 superpowers and the countries in the rival blocs led by the superpowers were expected to behave as rational and responsible actors. They were to be rational and responsible in the sense that they understood the risks in fighting wars that might involve the 2 superpowers. When 2 superpowers and the blocs led by them are in a deterrence relationship, fighting wars will be massively destructive. Responsibility, therefore, meant being restrained and avoiding the risk of another world war. In this sense, the Cold War managed to ensure human survival. The emergence of 2 power blocs, the 2 superpowers were keen on expanding their spheres of influence in different parts of the world. In a world sharply divided between the 2 alliance systems, a state was supposed to remain tied to its protective superpower to limit the influence of the other superpower and its allies. Smaller states in the alliances used the link to the superpowers for their own purposes. They got the promise of protection, weapons, and economic aid against their local rivals, mostly regional neighbors with whom they had rivalries. The alliance systems led by the 2 superpowers, therefore, threatened to divide the entire world into 2 camps. This division happened first in Europe. Most countries of Western Europe sided with the US and those of Eastern Europe joined the Soviet camp. That is why these were also called the Western and the Eastern alliances. The Western Alliance was formalized into an organization, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which came into existence in April 1949. It was an association of 12 states which declared that armed attack on any one of them in Europe or North America would be regarded as an attack on all of them. Each of these states would be obliged to help the other. The Eastern Alliance, known as the Warsaw Pact, was led by the Soviet Union. It was created in 1955 and its principal function was to counter NATO's forces in Europe. International alliances during the Cold War era were determined by the requirements of the superpowers and the calculations of the smaller states. As noted above, Europe became the main arena of conflict between the superpowers. In some cases, the superpowers used their military power to bring countries into their respective alliances. Soviet intervention in East Europe provides an example. The Soviet Union used its influence in Eastern Europe, backed by the very large presence of its armies in the countries of the region, to ensure that the eastern half of Europe remained within its sphere of influence. In East and Southeast Asia and in West Asia, Middle East, the United States built an alliance system called the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO, and the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO. The Soviet Union and Communist China responded by having close relations with regional countries such as North Vietnam, North Korea and Iraq. The Cold War threatened to divide the world into two alliances. Under these circumstances, many of the newly independent countries, after gaining their independence from the colonial powers such as Britain and France, were worried that they would lose their freedom as soon as they gained formal independence. Cracks and splits within the alliances were quick to appear. Communist China quarreled with the USSR towards the late 1950s, and, in 1969, they fought a brief war over a territorial dispute. The other important development was the non-aligned movement, NAM, which gave the newly independent countries a way of staying out of the alliances. You may ask why the superpowers needed any allies at all. After all, with their nuclear weapons and regular armies, they were so powerful that the combined power of most of the smaller states in Asia and Africa, and even in Europe, was no match to that of the superpowers. Yet, the smaller states were helpful for the superpowers in gaining access to 1. Vital resources, such as oil and minerals, 2. Territory, from where the superpowers could launch their weapons and troops, 3. Locations from where they could spy on each other. 4. Economic support, in that many small allies together could help pay for military expenses. They were also important for ideological reasons. The loyalty of allies suggested that the superpowers were winning the war of ideas as well, that liberal democracy and capitalism were better than socialism and communism, or vice versa. Arenas of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis that we began this chapter with was only one of the several crises that occurred during the Cold War. The Cold War also led to several shooting wars, but it is important to note that these crises and wars did not lead to another world war. The two superpowers were poised for direct confrontations in Korea 1950-53, Berlin 1958-62, the Congo the early 1960s, and in several other places. Crises deepened, as neither of the parties involved was willing to back down. When we talk about arenas of the Cold War, we refer, therefore, to areas where crisis and war occurred or threatened to occur between the alliance systems but did not cross certain limits. A great many lives were lost in some of these arenas like Korea, Vietnam and Afghanistan, but the world was spared a nuclear war and global hostilities. In some cases, huge military buildups were reported. In many cases, diplomatic communication between the superpowers could not be sustained and contributed to the misunderstandings. Sometimes, countries outside the two blocs, for example, the non-aligned countries, played a role in reducing Cold War conflicts and averting some grave crises. Jawaharlal Nehru, one of the key leaders of the NAM, played a crucial role in mediating between the two Koreas. In the Congo crisis, the UN General played a key mediatory role. By and large, it was the realization on a superpower's part that war by all means should be avoided that made them exercise restraint and behave more responsibly in international affairs. As the Cold War rolled from one arena to another, the logic of restraint was increasingly evident. However, since the Cold War did not eliminate rivalries between the two alliances, mutual suspicions led them to arm themselves to the teeth and to constantly prepare for war. Huge stocks of arms were considered necessary to prevent wars from taking place. The two sides understood that war might occur in spite of restraint. Either side might miscalculate the number of weapons in the possession of the other side. They might misunderstand the intentions of the other side. Besides, what if there was a nuclear accident? What would happen if someone fired off a nuclear weapon by mistake, or if a soldier mischievously shot off a weapon deliberately to start a war? What if an accident occurred with a nuclear weapon? How would the leaders of that country know it was an accident and not an act of sabotage by the enemy, or that a missile had not landed from the other side? In time, therefore, the ASEAN and USSR decided to collaborate in limiting or eliminating certain kinds of nuclear and non-nuclear weapons. A stable balance of weapons, they decided, could be maintained through arms control. Starting in the 1960s, the two sides signed 3 significant agreements within a decade. These were the Limited Test Ban Treaty, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Thereafter, the superpowers held several rounds of arms limitation talks and signed several more treaties to limit their arms. Challenge to bipolarity. We have already seen how the Cold War tended to divide the world into 2 rival alliances. It was in this context that non-alignment offered the newly decolonized countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America a third option, not to join either alliance. The roots of NAM went back to the friendship between 3 leaders, Yugoslavia's Josip Broz Tito, India's Jawaharlal Nehru, and Egypt's leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, who held a meeting in 1956. Indonesia's Sukarno and Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah strongly supported them. These 5 leaders came to be known as the 5 founders of NAM. The first non-aligned summit was held in Belgrade in 1961. This was the culmination of at least 3 factors: 1. Cooperation among these 5 countries, 2. Growing Cold War tensions and its widening arenas, and 3. The dramatic entry of many newly decolonized African countries into the international arena. By 1960, there were 16 new African members in the UN. The first summit was attended by 25 member states. Over the years, the membership of NAM has expanded. The latest meeting, the 14th summit, was held in Havana in 2006. It included 116 member states and 15 observer countries. As non-alignment grew into a popular international movement, countries of various different political systems and interests joined it. This made the movement less homogeneous and also made it more difficult to define in very neat and precise terms, what did it really stand for. Increasingly, NAM was easier to define in terms of what it was not. It was not about being a member of an alliance. The policy of staying away from alliances should not be considered isolationism or neutrality. Non-alignment is not isolationism, since isolationism means remaining aloof from world affairs. Isolationism sums up the foreign policy of the US from the American War of Independence in 1787 up to the beginning of the First World War. In comparison, the non-aligned countries, including India, played an active role in mediating between the 2 rival alliances in the cause of peace and stability. Their strength was based on their unity and their resolve to remain non-aligned despite the attempt by the 2 superpowers to bring them into their alliances. Non-alignment is also not neutrality. Neutrality refers principally to a policy of staying out of war. States practicing neutrality are not required to help end a war. They do not get involved in wars and do not take any position on the appropriateness or morality of a war. Non-aligned states, including India, were actually involved in wars for various reasons. They also worked to prevent war between others and tried to end wars that had broken out. New international economic order. The non-aligned countries were more than merely mediators during the Cold War. The challenge for most of the non-aligned countries, a majority of them were categorized as the least developed countries, LDCs, was to be more developed economically and to lift their people out of poverty. Economic development was also vital for the independence of the new countries. Without sustained development, a country could not be truly free. It would remain dependent on the richer countries, including the colonial powers from which political freedom had been achieved. The idea of a new international economic order (NIEO) originated with this realization. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development (UNCTAD) brought out a report in 1972 entitled Towards a New Trade Policy for Development. The report proposed a reform of the global trading system so as to give the LDCs control over their natural resources exploited by the developed Western countries, obtain access to Western markets so that the LDCs could sell their products and, therefore, make trade more beneficial for the poorer countries, i.e., reduce the cost of technology from the Western countries, and, provide the LDCs with a greater role in international economic institutions. Gradually, the nature of non-alignment changed to give greater importance to economic issues. In 1961, at the first summit in Belgrade, economic issues had not been very important. By the mid-1970s, they had become the most important issues. As a result, NAM became an economic pressure group. By the late 1980s, however, the NIEO initiative had faded, mainly because of the stiff opposition from the developed countries who acted as a united group while the non-aligned countries struggled to maintain their unity in the face of this opposition. India and the Cold War. As a leader of NAM, India's response to the ongoing Cold War was twofold. At one level, it took particular care in staying away from the two alliances. Second, it raised its voice against the newly decolonized countries becoming part of these alliances. India's policy was neither negative nor passive. As Nehru reminded the world, non-alignment was not a policy of fleeing away. On the contrary, India was in favor of actively intervening in world affairs to soften Cold War rivalries. India tried to reduce the differences between the alliances and thereby prevent differences from escalating into a full-scale war. Indian diplomats and leaders were often used to communicate and mediate between Cold War rivals, such as in the Korea War in the early 1950s. It is important to remember that India chose to involve other members of the non-aligned group in this mission. During the Cold War, India repeatedly tried to activate those regional and international organizations, which were not a part of the alliances led by the US and USSR. Nehru reposed great faith in a genuine commonwealth of free and cooperating nations that would play a positive role in softening, if not ending, the Cold War. Non-alignment was not, as some suggest, a noble international cause which had little to do with India's real interests. A non-aligned posture also served India's interests very directly, in at least two ways. First, non-alignment allowed India to take international decisions and stances that served its interests rather than the interests of the superpowers and their allies. Second, India was often able to balance one superpower against the other. If India felt ignored or unduly pressurized by one superpower, it could tilt towards the other. Neither alliance system could take India for granted or bully it. India's policy of non-alignment was criticized on a number of counts. Here we may refer to only two criticisms. First, India's non-alignment was said to be unprincipled. In the name of pursuing its national interest, India, it was said, often refused to take a firm stand on crucial international issues. Second, it is suggested that India was inconsistent and took contradictory postures. Having criticized others for joining alliances, India signed the Treaty of Friendship in August 1971 with the USSR for 20 years. This was regarded, particularly by outside observers, as virtually joining the Soviet alliance system. The Indian government's view was that the Cold War-era India needed diplomatic and possibly military support during the Bangladesh crisis, and that in any case the treaty did not stop India from having good relations with other countries including the US. Non-alignment as a strategy evolved in the Cold War context. As we will see in Chapter 2, with the disintegration of the USSR and the end of the Cold War in 1991, non-alignment, both as an international movement and as the core of India's foreign policy, lost some of its earlier relevance and effectiveness. However, non-alignment contained some core values and enduring ideas. It was based on a recognition that decolonized states share a historical affiliation and can become a powerful force if they come together. It meant that the poor and often very small countries of the world need not become followers of any of the big powers, that they could pursue an independent foreign policy. It was also based on a resolve to democratize the international system by thinking about an alternative world order to redress existing inequities. These core ideas remain relevant even after the Cold War has ended. Arms Control Treaties Limited Test Ban Treaty (LTBT) banned nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in outer space and underwater. Signed by the US, UK and USSR in Moscow on the 5th of August 1963. Entered into force on the 10th of October 1963. Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT) allows only the nuclear weapon states to have nuclear weapons and stops others from acquiring them. For the purposes of the NPT, a nuclear weapon state is one which has manufactured and exploded a nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device prior to the 1st of January 1967. So there are 5 nuclear weapon states: US, USSR, later Russia, Britain, France and China. Signed. Washington, London, and Moscow on the 1st of July 1968. Entered into force on the 5th of March 1970. Extended indefinitely in 1995. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 1, SALT 1. The first round of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks began in November 1969. The Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and the US President Richard Nixon signed the following in Moscow on the 26th of May 1972: A. Treaty on the Limitation of Anti-Ballistic Missile Systems (ABM Treaty), and B. Interim Agreement on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms. Entered into force on the 3rd of October 1972. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 2, SALT 2. The second round started in November 1972. The US President Jimmy Carter and the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev signed the Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms in Vienna on the 18th of June 1979. Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 1, START 1, treaty signed by the USSR President Mikhail Gorbachev and the US President George Bush, Sr., on the reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms in Moscow on the 31st of July 1991. Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 2, START 2, treaty signed by the Russian President Boris Yeltsin and the US President George Bush, Sr., on the reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms in Moscow on the 3rd of January 1993. These pictures depict the destruction caused by the bombs dropped by the US on Hiroshima. The bomb was codenamed Little Boy, and Nagasaki, codenamed Fat Man. Yet, these bombs were very small in their destructive capacity, measured in terms of kiloton yield, as compared to the nuclear bombs that were to be available in the stockpiles assembled by the superpowers. The yield of Little Boy and Fat Man were 15 and 21 kilotons respectively. By the early 1950s, the US and the USSR were already making thermonuclear weapons that had a yield between 10 and 15,000 kilotons. In other words, these bombs were 1,000 times more destructive than the bombs used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During much of the Cold War, both the superpowers possessed thousands of such weapons. Just imagine the extent of destruction that these could cause all over the globe. The Cold War Timeline. 1947 American President Harry Truman's doctrine about the containment of communism. 1947 to 1952 Marshall Plan, US aid for the reconstruction of the Western Europe. 1948 to 1949 Berlin blockade by the Soviet Union and the airlift of supplies to the citizens of West Berlin by the US and its allies. 1950 to 1953 Korean War, division of Korea along the 38th parallel. 1954 defeat of the French by the Vietnamese at Dien Bien Phu. Signing of the Geneva Accords, division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel, formation of SEATO. 1954 to 1975 American intervention in Vietnam. 1955 signing of the Baghdad Pact, later CENTO. 1956 Soviet intervention in Hungary. 1961 U-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Construction of the Berlin Wall. 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. 1965 American intervention in the Dominican Republic. 1968 Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia. 1972 as President Richard Nixon's visit to China. 1978 to 1989 Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia. 1979 to 1989 Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. 1985 Gorbachev becomes the president of the USSR, begins the reform process. 1989 Fall of the Berlin Wall, mass protests against governments in Eastern Europe. 1990 Unification of Germany. 1991 Disintegration of the Soviet Union. End of the Cold War era. Founder figures of NAM Josip Broz Tito, 1892 to 1980, President of Yugoslavia, 1945 to 1980, fought against Germany in World War I, communist, maintained some distance from the Soviet Union, forged unity in Yugoslavia. Jawaharlal Nehru, 1889 to 1964, first Prime Minister of India, 1947 to 1964, made efforts for Asian unity, decolonization, nuclear disarmament, advocated peaceful coexistence for securing world peace. Gamal Abdel Nasser, 1918 to 1970, ruled Egypt from 1952 to 1970, espoused the causes of Arab nationalism, socialism and anti-imperialism, nationalized the Suez Canal, leading to an international conflict in Sukarno, 1901 to 1970, first President of Indonesia, 1945 to 1965, led the freedom struggle, espoused the causes of socialism and anti-imperialism, organized the Bandung Conference, overthrown in a military coup. Kwame Nkrumah, 1909 to 1972, first Prime Minister of Ghana, 1952 to 1966, led the freedom movement, advocated the causes of socialism and African unity, opposed neocolonialism, removed in a military coup. Chapter 2 The End of Bipolarity. Overview The Berlin Wall, which had been built at the height of the Cold War and was its greatest symbol, was toppled by the people in 1989. This dramatic event was followed by an equally dramatic and historic chain of events that led to the collapse of the Second World and the end of the Cold War. Germany, divided after the Second World War, was unified. One after another, the 8 East European countries that were part of the Soviet bloc replaced their communist governments in response to mass demonstrations. The Soviet Union stood by as the Cold War began to end, not by military means but as a result of mass actions by ordinary men and women. Eventually the Soviet Union itself disintegrated. In this chapter, we discuss the meaning, the causes and the consequences of the disintegration of the Second World. We also discuss what happened to that part of the world after the collapse of communist regimes and how India relates to these countries now. What was the Soviet system? The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, came into being after the Socialist Revolution in Russia in 1917. The revolution was inspired by the ideals of socialism, as opposed to capitalism, and the need for an egalitarian society. This was perhaps the biggest attempt in human history to abolish the institution of private property and consciously design a society based on principles of equality. In doing so, the makers of the Soviet system gave primacy to the state and the institution of the party. The Soviet political system centered around the Communist Party, and no other political party or opposition was allowed. The economy was planned and controlled by the state. After the Second World War, the East European countries that the Soviet Army had liberated from the fascist forces came under the control of the USSR. The political and the economic systems of all these countries were modeled after the USSR. This group of countries was called the Second World or the Socialist Bloc. The Warsaw Pact, a military alliance, held them together. The USSR was the leader of the bloc. The Soviet Union became a great power after the Second World War. The Soviet economy was then more developed than the rest of the world except for the U.S. It had a complex communications network, vast energy resources including oil, iron and steel, machinery production, and a transport sector that connected its remotest areas with efficiency. It had a domestic consumer industry that produced everything from pins to cars, though their quality did not match that of the Western capitalist countries. The Soviet state ensured a minimum standard of living for all citizens, and the government subsidized basic necessities including health, education, childcare and other welfare schemes. There was no unemployment. State ownership was the dominant form of ownership. Land and productive assets were owned and controlled by the Soviet state. The Soviet system, however, became very bureaucratic and authoritarian, making life very difficult for its citizens. Lack of democracy and the absence of freedom of speech stifled people who often expressed their dissent in jokes and cartoons. Most of the institutions of the Soviet state needed reform. The one-party system represented by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had tight control over all institutions and was unaccountable to the people. The party refused to recognize the urge of people in the 15 different republics that formed the Soviet Union to manage their own affairs including their cultural affairs. Although, on paper, Russia was only one of the 15 republics that together constituted the USSR, in reality Russia dominated everything, and people from other regions felt neglected and often suppressed. In the arms race, the Soviet Union managed to match the US from time to time, but at great cost. The Soviet Union lagged behind the West in technology, infrastructure, e.g. transport, power, and most importantly, in fulfilling the political or economic aspirations of citizens. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 weakened the system even further. Though wages continued to grow, productivity and technology fell considerably behind that of the West. This led to shortages in all consumer goods. Food imports increased every year. The Soviet economy was faltering in the late 1970s and became stagnant. Gorbachev and the disintegration. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had become General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985, sought to reform this system. Reforms were necessary to keep the USSR abreast of the information and technological revolutions taking place in the West. However, Gorbachev's decision to normalize relations with the West and democratize and reform the Soviet Union had some other effects that neither he nor anyone else intended or anticipated. The people in the East European countries which were part of the Soviet bloc started to protest against their own governments and Soviet control. Unlike in the past, the Soviet Union, under Gorbachev, did not intervene when the disturbances occurred, and the communist regimes collapsed one after another. These developments were accompanied by a rapidly escalating crisis within the USSR that hastened its disintegration. Gorbachev initiated the policies of economic and political reform and democratization within the country. The reforms were opposed by leaders within the Communist Party. A coup took place in 1991 that was encouraged by Communist Party hardliners. The people had tasted freedom by then and did not want the old-style rule of the Communist Party. Boris Yeltsin emerged as a national hero in opposing this coup. The Russian Republic, where Yeltsin won a popular election, began to shake off centralized control. Power began to shift from the Soviet center to the republics, especially in the more Europeanized part of the Soviet Union, which saw themselves as sovereign states. The Central Asian republics did not ask for independence and wanted to remain with the Soviet Federation. In December 1991, under the leadership of Yeltsin, Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, three major republics of the USSR, declared that the Soviet Union was disbanded. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was banned. Capitalism and democracy were adopted as the basis for the post-Soviet republics. Declaration on the Disintegration of the USSR and the Formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States (CIs) came as a surprise to the other republics, especially to the Central Asian ones. The exclusion of these republics was an issue that was quickly solved by making them founding members of the CIs. Russia was now accepted as the successor state of the Soviet Union. It inherited the Soviet seat in the UN-Security Council. Russia accepted all the international treaties and commitments of the Soviet Union. It took over as the only nuclear state of the post-Soviet space and carried out some nuclear disarmament measures with the U.S. The old Soviet Union was thus dead and buried. Why did the Soviet Union disintegrate? How did the second most powerful country in the world suddenly disintegrate? This is a question worth asking not just to understand the Soviet Union and the end of communism but also because it is not the first and may not be the last political system to collapse. While there are unique features of the Soviet collapse, there may be more general lessons to be drawn from this very important case. There is no doubt that the internal weaknesses of Soviet political and economic institutions, which failed to meet the aspirations of the people, were responsible for the collapse of the system. Economic stagnation for many years led to severe consumer shortages and a large section of Soviet society began to doubt and question the system and to do so openly. Why did the system become so weak and why did the economy stagnate? The answer is partially clear. The Soviet economy used much of its resources in maintaining a nuclear and military arsenal and the development of its satellite states in Eastern Europe and within the Soviet system, the 5 Central Asian republics in particular. This led to a huge economic burden that the system could not cope with. At the same time, ordinary citizens became more knowledgeable about the economic advance of the West. They could see the disparities between their system and the systems of the West. After years of being told that the Soviet system was better than Western capitalism, the reality of its backwardness came as a political and psychological shock. The Soviet Union had become stagnant in an administrative and political sense as well. The Communist Party that had ruled the Soviet Union for over 70 years was not accountable to the people. Ordinary people were alienated by slow and stifling administration, rampant corruption, the inability of the system to correct mistakes it had made, the unwillingness to allow more openness in government, and the centralization of authority in a vast land. Worse still, the party bureaucrats gained more privileges than ordinary citizens. People did not identify with the system and with the rulers, and the government increasingly lost popular backing. Gorbachev's reforms promised to deal with these problems. Gorbachev promised to reform the economy, catch up with the West, and loosen the administrative system. You may wonder why the Soviet Union collapsed in spite of Gorbachev's accurate diagnosis of the problem and his attempt to implement reforms. Here is where the answers become more controversial, and we have to depend on future historians to guide us better. The most basic answer seems to be that when Gorbachev carried out his reforms and loosened the system, he set in motion forces and expectations that few could have predicted and became virtually impossible to control. There were sections of Soviet society which felt that Gorbachev should have moved much faster and were disappointed and impatient with his methods. They did not benefit in the way they had hoped, or they benefited too slowly. Others, especially members of the Communist Party and those who were served by the system, took exactly the opposite view. They felt that their power and privileges were eroding and Gorbachev was moving too quickly. In this tug of war, Gorbachev lost support on all sides and divided public opinion. Even those who were with him became disillusioned as they felt that he did not adequately defend his own policies. All this might not have led to the collapse of the Soviet Union but for another development that surprised most observers and indeed many insiders. The rise of nationalism and the desire for sovereignty within various republics including Russia and the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia, and others proved to be the final and most immediate cause for the disintegration of the USSR. Here again there are differing views. One view is that nationalist urges and feelings were very much at work throughout the history of the Soviet Union, and that whether or not the reforms had occurred there would have been an internal struggle within the Soviet Union. This is a what if of history, but surely it is not an unreasonable view given the size and diversity of the Soviet Union and its growing internal problems. Others think that Gorbachev's reforms speeded up and increased nationalist dissatisfaction to the point that the government and rulers could not control it. Ironically, during the Cold War many thought that nationalist unrest would be strongest in the Central Asian republics given their ethnic and religious differences with the rest of the Soviet Union and their economic backwardness. However, as things turned out, nationalist dissatisfaction with the Soviet Union was strongest in the more European and prosperous part, in Russia and the Baltic areas as well as Ukraine and Georgia. Ordinary people here felt alienated from the Central Asians and from each other and concluded also that they were paying too high an economic price to keep the more backward areas within the Soviet Union. Consequences of disintegration. The collapse of the Second World of the Soviet Union and the socialist systems in Eastern Europe had profound consequences for world politics. Let us note here three broad kinds of enduring changes that resulted from it. Each of these had a number of effects that we cannot list here. First of all, it meant the end of Cold War confrontations. The ideological dispute over whether the socialist system would beat the capitalist system was not an issue anymore. Since this dispute had engaged the military of the two blocs, had triggered a massive arms race and accumulation of nuclear weapons, and had led to the existence of military blocs, the end of the confrontation demanded an end to this arms race and a possible new peace. Second, power relations in world politics changed and, therefore, the relative influence of ideas and institutions also changed. The end of the Cold War left open only two possibilities: either the remaining superpower would dominate and create a unipolar system, or different countries or groups of countries could become important players in the international system, thereby bringing in a multipolar system where no one power could dominate. As it turned out, the US became the sole superpower. Backed by the power and prestige of the US, the capitalist economy was now the dominant economic system internationally. Institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund became powerful advisors to all these countries since they gave them loans for their transitions to capitalism. Politically, the notion of liberal democracy emerged as the best way to organize political life. Third, the end of the Soviet bloc meant the emergence of many new countries. All these countries had their own independent aspirations and choices. Some of them, especially the Baltic and East European states, wanted to join the European Union and become part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The Central Asian countries wanted to take advantage of their geographical location and continue their close ties with Russia and also to establish ties with the West, the US, China and others. Thus, the international system saw many new players emerge, each with its own identity, interests, and economic and political difficulties. It is to these issues that we now turn. Shock therapy in post-communist regimes. The collapse of communism was followed in most of these countries by a painful process of transition from an authoritarian socialist system to a democratic capitalist system. The model of transition in Russia, Central Asia and East Europe that was influenced by the World Bank and the IMF came to be known as shock therapy. Shock therapy varied in intensity and speed amongst the former Second World countries, but its direction and features were quite similar. Each of these countries was required to make a total shift to a capitalist economy, which meant rooting out completely any structures evolved during the Soviet period. Above all, it meant that private ownership was to be the dominant pattern of ownership of property. Privatization of state assets and corporate ownership patterns were to be immediately brought in. Collective farms were to be replaced by private farming and capitalism in agriculture. This transition ruled out any alternate or third way, other than state-controlled socialism or capitalism. Shock therapy also involved a drastic change in the external orientation of these economies. Development was now envisaged through more trade, and thus a sudden and complete switch to free trade was considered essential. The free trade regime and foreign direct investment (FDI) were to be the main engines of change. This also involved openness to foreign investment, financial opening up or deregulation, and currency convertibility. Finally, the transition also involved a breakup of the existing trade alliances among the countries of the Soviet bloc. Each state from this bloc was now linked directly to the West and not to each other in the region. These states were thus to be gradually absorbed into the Western economic system. The Western capitalist states now became the leaders and thus guided and controlled the development of the region through various agencies and organizations. Consequences of shock therapy. The shock therapy administered in the 1990s did not lead the people into the promised utopia of mass consumption. Generally, it brought ruin to the economies and disaster upon the people of the entire region. In Russia, the large state-controlled industrial complex almost collapsed, as about 90% of its industries were put up for sale to private individuals and companies. Since the restructuring was carried out through market forces and not by government-directed industrial policies, it led to the virtual disappearance of entire industries. This was called the largest garage sale in history, as valuable industries were undervalued and sold at throwaway prices. Though all citizens were given vouchers to participate in the sales, most citizens sold their vouchers in the black market because they needed the money. The value of the ruble, the Russian currency, declined dramatically. The rate of inflation was so high that people lost all their savings. The collective farm system disintegrated, leaving people without food security, and Russia started to import food. The real GDP of Russia in 1999 was below what it was in 1989. The old trading structure broke down with no alternative in its place. The old system of social welfare was systematically destroyed. The withdrawal of government subsidies pushed large sections of the people into poverty. The middle classes were pushed to the periphery of society, and the academic and intellectual manpower disintegrated or migrated. A mafia emerged in most of these countries and started controlling many economic activities. Privatization led to new disparities. Post-Soviet states, especially Russia, were divided between rich and poor regions. Unlike the earlier system, there was now great economic inequality between people. The construction of democratic institutions was not given the same attention and priority as the demands of economic transformation. The constitutions of all these countries were drafted in a hurry, and most, including Russia, had a strong executive president with the widest possible powers that rendered elected parliaments relatively weak. In Central Asia, the presidents had great powers, and several of them became very authoritarian. For example, the presidents of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan appointed themselves to power first for 10 years and then extended it for another 10 years. They allowed no dissent or opposition. A judicial culture and independence of the judiciary was yet to be established in most of these countries. Most of these economies, especially Russia, started reviving in 2000, 10 years after their independence. The reason for the revival for most of their economies was the export of natural resources like oil, natural gas and minerals. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are major oil and gas producers. Other countries have gained because of the oil pipelines that cross their territories for which they get rent. Some amount of manufacturing has restarted. Tensions and conflicts. Most of the former Soviet republics are prone to conflicts, and many have had civil wars and insurgencies. Complicating the picture is the growing involvement of outside powers. In Russia, two republics, Chechnya and Dagestan, have had violent secessionist movements. Moscow's method of dealing with the Chechen rebels and indiscriminate military bombings have led to many human rights violations but failed to deter the aspirations for independence. In Central Asia, Tajikistan witnessed a civil war that went on for 10 years till 2001. The region as a whole has many sectarian conflicts. In Azerbaijan's province of Nagorno-Karabakh, some local Armenians want to secede and join Armenia. In Georgia, the demand for independence has come from two provinces, resulting in a civil war. There are movements against the existing regimes in Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan and Georgia. Countries and provinces are fighting over river waters. All this has led to instability, making life difficult for the ordinary citizen. The Central Asian republics are areas with vast hydrocarbon resources, which have brought them economic benefit. Central Asia has also become a zone of competition between outside powers and oil companies. The region is next to Russia, China, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and close to West Asia. After the 11th of September 2001, the US wanted military bases in the region and paid the governments of all Central Asian states to hire bases and to allow airplanes to fly over their territory during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. However, Russia perceives these states as its near abroad and believes that they should be under Russian influence. China has interests here because of the oil resources, and the Chinese have begun to settle around the embedded in a history of trust and common interests and are matched by popular perceptions. Indian heroes from Raj Kapoor to Amitabh Bachchan are household names in Russia and many post-Soviet countries. One can hear Hindi film songs all over the region, and India is part of the popular memory. Russia and India share a vision of a multipolar world order. What they mean by a multipolar world: borders and conduct trade. In Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia split peacefully into two, with the Czechs and the Slovaks forming independent countries. But the most severe conflict took place in the Balkan republics of Yugoslavia. After 1991, it broke apart with several provinces like Croatia, Slovenia and Bosnia and Herzegovina declaring independence. Ethnic Serbs opposed this, and a massacre of non-Serb Bosnians followed. The NATO intervention and the bombing of Yugoslavia followed the inter-ethnic civil war. India and post-communist countries. India has maintained good relations with all the post-communist countries. But the strongest relations are still those between Russia and India. India's relations with Russia are an important aspect of India's foreign policy. Indo-ASEAN relations are embedded in a history of trust and common interests and are matched by popular perceptions. Indian heroes from Raj Kapoor to Amitabh Bachchan are household names in Russia and many post-Soviet countries. One can hear Hindi film songs all over the region, and India is part of the popular memory. Russia and India share a vision of a multipolar world order. What they mean by a multipolar world order is the coexistence of several powers in the international system, collective security, in which an attack on any country is regarded as a threat to all countries and requires a collective response, greater regionalism, negotiated settlements of international conflicts, an independent foreign policy for all countries, and decision-making through bodies like the UN that should be strengthened, democratized, and empowered. More than 80 bilateral agreements have been signed between India and Russia as part of the Indo-ASEAN Strategic Agreement of 2001. India stands to benefit from its relationship with Russia on issues like Kashmir, energy supplies, sharing information on international terrorism, access to Central Asia, and balancing its relations with China. Russia stands to benefit from this relationship because India is the second largest arms market for Russia. The Indian military gets most of its hardware from Russia. Since India is an oil-importing nation, Russia is important to India and has repeatedly come to the assistance of India during its oil crises. India is seeking to increase its energy imports from Russia and the republics of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Cooperation with these republics includes partnership and investment in oil fields. Russia is important for India's nuclear energy plans and assisted India's space industry by giving, for example, the cryogenic rocket when India needed it. Russia and India have collaborated on various scientific projects. The Berlin Wall symbolized the division between the capitalist and the communist world. Built in 1961 to separate East Berlin from West Berlin, this more than 150-kilometer-long wall stood for 28 years and was finally broken by the people on the 9th of November 1989. This marked the unification of the two parts of Germany and the beginning of the end of the communist bloc. The pictures here depict 1. People making a tiny hole in the wall. 2. A section of the wall opened to allow free movement. 3. The Berlin Wall as it stood before 1989. Leaders of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Lenin. 4. 1870 to 1924, founder of the Bolshevik Communist Party, leader of the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the founder-head of the USSR during the most difficult period following the revolution, 1917 to 1924, an outstanding theoretician and practitioner of Marxism and a source of inspiration for communists all over the world. Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953, successor to Lenin and led the Soviet Union during its consolidation, 1924 to 1953, began rapid industrialization and forcible collectivization of agriculture, credited with Soviet victory in the Second World War, held responsible for the Great Terror of the 1930s, authoritarian functioning and elimination of rivals within the party. Nikita Khrushchev, 1894 to 1971, leader of the Soviet Union, 1953 to 1964, denounced Stalin's leadership style and introduced some reforms in 1956, suggested peaceful coexistence with the West, involved in suppressing popular rebellion in Hungary and in the Cuban Missile Crisis. A Communist Party bureaucrat drives down from Moscow to a collective farm to register a potato harvest. Comrade farmer, how has the harvest been this year? The official asks. Oh, by the grace of God, we had mountains of potatoes, answers the farmer. But there is no God, counters the official. Who, says the farmer, and there are no mountains of potatoes either. Leonid Brezhnev, 1906 to 1982, leader of the Soviet Union, 1964 to 1982, proposed Asian collective security system, associated with the détente phase in relations with the US, involved in suppressing a popular rebellion in Czechoslovakia and in invading Afghanistan. Mikhail Gorbachev, born 1931, last leader of the Soviet Union, 1985 to 1991, introduced economic and political reform policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, stopped the arms race with the US, withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan and Eastern Europe, helped in the unification of Germany, ended the Cold War, blamed for the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Timeline of disintegration of the Soviet Union. 1985 March, Mikhail Gorbachev elected as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, appoints Boris Yeltsin as the head of the Communist Party in Moscow, initiates a series of reforms in the Soviet Union. 1988, independence movement begins in Lithuania, later spreads to Estonia and Latvia. 1989 October, Soviet Union declares that the Warsaw Pact members are free to decide their own futures. Berlin Wall falls. November 1990 February, Gorbachev strips the Soviet Communist Party of its 72-year-long monopoly on power by calling on the Soviet Parliament, Duma, to permit multi-party politics. 1990 March, Lithuania becomes the first of the 15 Soviet republics to declare its independence. 1990 June, Russian Parliament declares its independence from the Soviet Union. 1991 June, Yeltsin, no longer in the Communist Party, becomes the president of Russia. 1991 August, the Communist Party hardliners stage an abortive coup against Gorbachev. 1991 September, three Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania become unmembers, later join NATO in March 2004. 1991 December, Russia, Belarus and Ukraine decide to annul the 1922 Treaty on the creation of the USSR and establish the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIs, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan join the CIs. Georgia joins later in 1993. Russia takes over the USSR seat in the United Nations. 1991 December 25. Gorbachev resigns as the president of the Soviet Union. The end of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin, born 1931, the first elected president of Russia, 1991 to 1999, rose to power in the Communist Party and was made the mayor of Moscow by Gorbachev, later joined the critics of Gorbachev and left the Communist Party, led the protests against the Soviet regime in 1991, played a key role in dissolving the Soviet Union, blamed for hardships suffered by Russians in their transition from communism to capitalism. As a result of shock therapy, about half of Russia's 1,500 banks and other financial institutions went bankrupt. This image is that of Incombank, Russia's second-largest bank, that went bankrupt in 1998. As a result, the money of 10,000 corporate and private shareholders was lost, along with the money kept in the bank by customers. Bollywood stirs Uzbek passions. 7 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, the Uzbek passion for Indian films continues. Within months of the release of the latest film in India, pirate copies were already on sale in the Uzbek capital, Tashkent. Muhammad Sharif Pat runs a shop selling Indian films near one of Tashkent's biggest markets. He is an Afghan who brings videos from the Pakistani frontier town Peshawar. There are many people who love Indian films here. I had say at least 70% of the people in Tashkent buy them. We sell about 100 videos a day. I have just had to put in an order for 1,000 more, he says. The Uzbeks are Central Asians, they are part of Asia. They have a common culture. That is why they like Indian films. Despite the shared history, for many Indians living in Uzbekistan, the passion the Uzbeks have for their films and film stars has come as a bit of a surprise. Wherever we go and meet local dignitaries, even ministers or cabinet ministers, during our conversation it is always mentioned, says Ashok Shamer from the Indian Embassy in Tashkent. This shows that Indian films, culture, songs and especially Raj Kapoor have been household names here. Most of them can sing some Hindi songs, they may not know the meaning but their pronunciation is correct and they know the music, he says. I have found out that almost all my neighbors can sing and play Hindi songs. This was really a big surprise to me when I came to Uzbekistan. A report by the BBC's Central Asia correspondent Luis Hidalgo. Flashback, India and the USSR. During the Cold War era, India and the USSR enjoyed a special relationship which led critics to say that India was part of the Soviet camp. It was a multi-dimensional relationship. Economic, the Soviet Union assisted India's public sector companies at a time when such assistance was difficult to get. It gave aid and technical assistance for steel plants like Bhilai, Bikara, Visakhapatnam, and machinery plants like Bharat Heavy Electricals Limited, etc. The Soviet Union accepted Indian currency for trade when India was short of foreign exchange. Political, the Soviet Union supported India's positions on the Kashmir issue in the UN. It also supported India during its major conflicts, especially during the war with Pakistan in 1971. India too supported Soviet foreign policy in some crucial but indirect ways. Military, India received most of its military hardware from the Soviet Union at a time when few other countries were willing to part with military technologies. The Soviet Union entered into various agreements allowing India to jointly produce military equipment. Culture, Hindi films and Indian culture were popular in the Soviet Union. A large number of Indian writers and artists visited the USSR. Chapter 3 is Hegemony in World Politics Overview. We have seen that the end of Cold War left the US without any serious rival in the world. The era since then has been described as a period of US dominance or a unipolar world. In this chapter, we try to understand the nature, extent and limits of this dominance. We begin by narrating the story of the rise of the New World Order from the First Gulf War to the US-led invasion of Iraq. We then pause to understand the nature of US domination with the help of the concept of hegemony. After exploring the political, economic and cultural aspects of US hegemony, we assess India's policy options in dealing with the US. Finally, we turn to see if there are challenges to this hegemony and whether it can be overcome. Aisha, Jabu and Andre. Aisha was doing very well in her studies at a high school in the outskirts of Baghdad, and was planning to study medicine in university. She lost a leg in 2003 when a missile slammed into an air raid shelter in which she was hiding with her friends. Now she is learning to walk all over again. She still plans to become a doctor, but only after the foreign armies leave her country. Jabu is a talented young artist who lives in Durban, South Africa. His paintings are heavily influenced by traditional tribal art forms. He wants to go to art school and later open his own studio. However, his father wants him to study for an MBA and then join the family business. The business is not doing too well. Jabu's father feels that with an MBA degree, Jabu will be able to make the family business profitable. Andre is a young man living in Perth, Australia. His parents are immigrants from Russia. His mother gets very angry every time Andre puts on blue jeans to go to church. She wants him to look respectable in church. Andre tells his mother that jeans are cool, that they give him the sense of freedom. Andre's father reminds his wife how they too used to wear jeans when they were youngsters in Leningrad, and for the same reason that their son now invokes. Andre has had an argument with his mother. Jabu may be forced to study a subject that he has no interest in. In contrast, Aisha has lost her leg and is lucky to be alive. How can we even discuss their problems in the same breath? We can, and must, do so. As we shall see in this chapter, all three have been, in different ways, affected by his hegemony. We will meet Aisha, Jabu and Andre again. But let us first understand how his hegemony began and how it operates in the world today. We will follow the popular usage of the word America to refer to the United States of America. But it may be useful to remind ourselves that the expression America covers the two continents of North and South America and that the US is only one of the countries of the American continent. Thus, the use of the word America solely for the US is already a sign of the US hegemony that we seek to understand in this chapter. Beginning of the New World Order, the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union took everyone by surprise. While one of the two superpowers ceased to exist, the other remained with all its powers intact, even enhanced. Thus, it would appear that the US hegemony began in 1991 after Soviet power disappeared from the international scene. This is largely correct, but we need to keep in mind two riders to this. First, as we shall see in this chapter, some aspects of US hegemony did not emerge in 1991 but in fact go back to the end of the Second World War in 1945. Second, the US did not start behaving like a hegemonic power right from 1991, it became clear much later that the world was in fact living in a period of hegemony. Let us therefore look at this process by which US hegemony got established more closely. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, rapidly occupying and subsequently annexing it. After series of diplomatic attempts failed at convincing Iraq to quit its aggression, the United Nations mandated the liberation of Kuwait by force. For the UN, this was a dramatic decision after years of deadlock during the Cold War. The US President George H.W. Bush hailed the emergence of a New World Order. A massive coalition force of 660,000 troops from 34 countries fought against Iraq and defeated it in what came to be known as the First Gulf War. However, the UN operation, which was called Operation Desert Storm, was overwhelmingly American. An American general, Norman Schwarzkopf, led the UN coalition and nearly 75% of the coalition forces were from the US. Although the Iraqi president, Saddam Hussein, had promised the mother of all battles, the Iraqi forces were quickly defeated and forced to withdraw from Kuwait. The First Gulf War revealed the vast technological gap that had opened up between the US military capability and that of other states. The highly publicized use of so-called smart bombs by the US led some observers to call this a computer war. Widespread television coverage also made it a video game war, with viewers around the world watching the destruction of Iraqi forces live on TV in the comfort of their living rooms. Incredibly, the IS may actually have made a profit from the war. According to many reports, the IS received more money from countries like Germany, Japan and Saudi Arabia than it had spent on the war. The Clinton years. Despite winning the first Gulf War, George H.W. Bush lost the IS presidential elections of 1992 to William Jefferson Bill Clinton of the Democratic Party, who had campaigned on domestic rather than foreign policy issues. Bill Clinton won again in 1996 and thus remained the president of the IS for 8 years. During the Clinton years, it often seemed that the IS had withdrawn into its internal affairs and was not fully engaged in world politics. In foreign policy, the Clinton government tended to focus on soft issues like democracy promotion, climate change and world trade rather than on the hard politics of military power and security. Nevertheless, the IS on occasion did show its readiness to use military power even during the Clinton years. The most important episode occurred in 1999, in response to Yugoslavian actions against the predominantly Albanian population in the province of Kosovo. The air forces of the NATO countries, led by the US, bombarded targets around Yugoslavia for well over 2 months, forcing the downfall of the government of Slobodan Milosevic and the stationing of a NATO force in Kosovo. Another significant IS military action during the Clinton years was in response to the bombing of the IS embassies in Nairobi, Kenya and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in 1998. These bombings were attributed to Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization strongly influenced by extremist Islamist ideas. Within a few days of this bombing, President Clinton ordered Operation Infinite Reach, a series of cruise missile strikes on Al-Qaeda terrorist targets in Sudan and Afghanistan. The IS did not bother about the unsanctioned or provisions of international law in this regard. It was alleged that some of the targets were civilian facilities unconnected to terrorism. In retrospect, this was merely the beginning. 9/11 and the Global War on Terror. On the 11th of September 2001, 19 hijackers hailing from a number of Arab countries took control of 4 American commercial aircraft shortly after takeoff and flew them into important buildings in the US. 1. Airliner each crashed into the north and south towers of the World Trade Center in New York. A third aircraft crashed into the Pentagon building in Arlington, Virginia, where the US Defense Department is headquartered. The fourth aircraft, presumably bound for the Capitol building of the US Congress, came down in a field in Pennsylvania. The attacks have come to be known as 9/11s. In America, the convention is to write the month first, followed by the date, hence the short form, 9/11s, instead of 11/9s, as we would write in India. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 persons. In terms of their shocking effect on Americans, they have been compared to the British burning of Washington, D.C. in 1814 and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. However, in terms of loss of life, 9/11 was the most severe attack on its soil since the founding of the country in 1776. The US response to 9/11 was swift and ferocious. Clinton had been succeeded in the US presidency by George W. Bush of the Republican Party, son of the earlier president George H. W. Bush. Unlike Clinton, Bush had a much harder view of US interests and of the means by which to advance them. As a part of its global war on terror, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom against all those suspected to be behind this attack, mainly Al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. The Taliban regime was easily overthrown, but remnants of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have remained potent, as is clear from the number of terrorist attacks launched by them against Western targets since. The US forces made arrests all over the world, often without the knowledge of the government of the persons being arrested, transported these persons across countries and detained them in secret prisons. Some of them were brought to Guantanamo Bay, a US naval base in Cuba, where the prisoners did not enjoy the protection of international law or the law of their own country or that of the US. Even the UN representatives were not allowed to meet these prisoners. The Iraq invasion. On the 19th of March 2003, the US launched its invasion of Iraq under the code name Operation Iraqi Freedom. More than 40 other countries joined in the US-led coalition of the willing after the UN refused to give its mandate to the invasion. The ostensible purpose of the invasion was to prevent Iraq from developing weapons of mass destruction, WMD. Since no evidence of WMD has been unearthed in Iraq, it is speculated that the invasion was motivated by other objectives, such as controlling Iraqi oil fields and installing a regime friendly to the US. Although the government of Saddam Hussein fell swiftly, the US has not been able to pacify Iraq. Instead, a full-fledged insurgency against its occupation was ignited in Iraq. While the US has lost over 3,000 military personnel in the war, Iraqi casualties are very much higher. It is conservatively estimated that 50,000 Iraqi civilians have been killed since the US-led invasion. It is now widely recognized that the US invasion of Iraq was, in some crucial respects, both a military and political failure. What does hegemony mean? Politics is about power. Just as individuals want to gain and retain power, groups too want to gain and retain power. We routinely talk of someone becoming powerful or someone doing something for power. In the case of world politics too, countries and groups of countries are engaged in constantly trying to gain and retain power. This power is in the form of military domination, economic power, political clout and cultural superiority. Therefore, if we wanted to understand world politics, it is necessary that we understand the distribution of power among the countries of the world. For instance, during the years of the Cold War, 1945 to 1991, power was divided between the two groups of countries, and the US and the Soviet Union represented the two camps or centers of power in international politics during that period. The collapse of the Soviet Union left the world with only a single power, the United States of America. Sometimes, the international system dominated by a sole superpower, or hyperpower, is called a unipolar system. This appears to be a misapplication of the idea of pole, derived from physics. It may be more appropriate to describe an international system with only one center of power by the term hegemony. We can identify three very different understandings of what hegemony is. Let us examine each of these meanings of hegemony and relate them to contemporary international politics. Therefore, if we wanted to understand world politics, it is necessary that we understand the distribution of power among the countries of the world. For instance, during the years of the Cold War, 1945 to 1991, power was divided between the two groups of countries, and the US and the Soviet Union represented the two camps or centers of power in international politics during that period. The collapse of the Soviet Union left the world with only a single power, the United States of America. Sometimes, the international system dominated by a sole superpower, or hyperpower, relations, patterns and balances of military capability between states. It is this notion of hegemony as military preponderance that is especially germane to the current position and role of the US in world politics. Do you remember Aisha, who lost her leg in an American missile attack? It is hard power hegemony that has broken Aisha's body, if not her spirit. Hegemony is hard power. The roots of the word hegemony lie in classical Greek. The word implies the leadership or predominance of one state, and was originally used to denote the preponderant position of Athens vis-a-vis the other city-states of ancient Greece. Thus, the first meaning of hegemony relates to the relations, patterns and balances of military capability between states. It is this notion of hegemony as military preponderance that is especially germane to the current position and role of the US in world politics. Do you remember Aisha, who lost her leg in an American missile attack? It is hard power hegemony that has broken Aisha's body, if not her spirit. The bedrock of contemporary US power lies in the overwhelming superiority of its military power. American military dominance today is both absolute and relative. In absolute terms, the US today has military capabilities that can reach any point on the planet accurately, lethally and in real time, thereby crippling the adversary while its own forces are sheltered to the maximum extent possible from the dangers of war. But even more awesome than the absolute capabilities of the US is the fact that no other power today can remotely match them. The US today spends more on its military capability than the next 12 powers combined. Furthermore, a large chunk of the Pentagon's budget goes into military research and development, or, in other words, technology. Thus, the military dominance of the US is not just based on higher military spending, but on a qualitative gap, a technological chasm that no other power can at present conceivably span. Undoubtedly, the US invasion of Iraq reveals several American vulnerabilities. The US has not been able to force the Iraqi people into submitting to the occupation forces of the US LED coalition. To fully understand the nature of American weakness, however, we need to have a historical perspective. Imperial powers through history have used military forces to accomplish only 4 tasks: to conquer, deter, punish and police. As the Iraq invasion shows, the American capacity to conquer is formidable. Similarly, the US capability to deter and to punish is self-evident. Whereas military capability has thus far been shown to have serious weaknesses is in policing in occupied territory. Hegemony is structural power. The second notion of hegemony is very different from the first. It emerges from a particular understanding of the world economy. The basic idea is that an open world economy requires a hegemon or dominant power to support its creation and existence. The hegemon must possess both the ability and the desire to establish certain norms for order and must sustain the global structure. The hegemon usually does this to its own advantage but often to its relative detriment, as its competitors take advantage of the openness of the world economy without paying the costs of maintaining its openness. Hegemony in this second sense is reflected in the role played by the US in providing global public goods. By public goods we mean those goods that can be consumed by one person without reducing the amount of the good available for someone else. Fresh air and roads are examples of public goods. In the context of the world economy, the best examples of a global public good are sealness of communication, SLOCs, the sea routes commonly used by merchant ships. Free trade in an open world economy would not be possible without open SLOCs. It is the naval power of the hegemon that underwrites the law of the sea and ensures freedom of navigation in international waters. Since the decline of British naval power after the Second World War, the multi-oceanic US Navy has played this role. Another example of a global public good is the Internet. Although it is seen today as making the virtual world of the World Wide Web possible, we should not forget that the Internet is the direct outcome of a US military research project that began in 1950. Even today, the Internet relies on a global network of satellites, most of which are owned by the US government. As we know, the US is present in all parts of the world, in all sectors of the world economy and in all areas of technology. The US share of the world economy remains an enormous 28%. The US also accounts for 15% of world trade, if intra-European Union trade is included in world trade data. There is not a single sector of the world economy in which an American firm does not feature in the top 3 list. It is important to remember that the economic preponderance of the US is inseparable from its structural power, which is the power to shape the global economy in a particular way. After all, the Bretton Woods system, set up by the US after the Second World War, still constitutes the basic structure of the world economy. Thus, we can regard the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Trade Organization, WTO, as the products of American hegemony. A classic example of the structural power of the US is the academic degree called the Masters in Business Administration, MBA. The idea that business is a profession that depends upon skills that can be taught in a university is uniquely American. The first business school in the world, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, was established in 1881. The first MBA courses were initiated around 1900. The first MBA course outside the US was established only in 1950. Today, there is no country in the world in which the MBA is not a prestigious academic degree. This takes us back to our South African friend Jabu. Structural hegemony explains why Jabu's father is insisting that his son gives up painting and studies for the MBA instead. Hegemony is soft power. It would, however, be a mistake to see as hegemony in purely military and economic terms without considering the ideological or the cultural dimension of its hegemony. This third sense of hegemony about the capacity to manufacture consent. Here, hegemony implies class ascendancy in the social, political and particularly ideological spheres. Hegemony arises when the dominant class or country can win the consent of dominated classes, by persuading the dominated classes to view the world in a manner favorable to the ascendancy of the dominant class. Adapted to the field of world politics, this notion of hegemony suggests that a dominant power deploys not only military power but also ideological resources to shape the behavior of competing and lesser powers. The behavior of the weaker countries is influenced in ways that favor the interests of the most powerful country, in particular its desire to remain preeminent. Consent, in other words, goes hand in hand with, and is often more effective than, coercion. The predominance of the US in the world today is based not only on its military power and economic prowess, but also on its cultural presence. Whether we choose to recognize the fact or not, all ideas of the good life and personal success, most of the dreams of individuals and societies across the globe, are dreams churned out by practices prevailing in 20th century America. America is the most seductive, and in this sense the most powerful, culture on earth. This attribute is called soft power, the ability to persuade rather than coerce. Over time we get so used to hegemony that we hardly notice it, any more than we notice the rivers, birds, and trees around us. You could not have forgotten Andrei and his cool pair of blue jeans. When his parents were youngsters in the Soviet Union, blue jeans were the ultimate symbol of liberation for their generation. Young men and women often spent over a year's salary to buy blue jeans from foreign tourists on the black market. Somehow, for an entire Soviet generation, blue jeans came to represent aspirations of the good life that were not available in their own country. During the Cold War, the US found it difficult to score victories against the Soviet Union in the realm of hard power. It was in the area of structural power and soft power that the US scored notable victories. Although the Soviet centrally planned economy provided an alternate model of internal economic organization, the world economy throughout the Cold War years remained a world capitalist economy. But it was in the area of soft power that the US was ultimately triumphant. As the example of blue jeans in the Soviet Union clearly shows, the US was able to engineer a generational divide in Soviet society on the basis of a cultural product. Constraints on American power. History tells us that empires decline because they decay from within. Similarly, the biggest constraints to American hegemony lie within the heart of hegemony itself. We can identify 3 constraints on American power. None of these constraints seemed to operate in the years following 9/11. However, it now appears that all 3 of these constraints are slowly beginning to operate again. The first constraint is the institutional architecture of the American state itself. A system of division of powers between the 3 branches of government places significant brakes upon the unrestrained and immoderate exercise of America's military power by the executive branch. The second constraint on American power is also domestic in nature, and stems from the open nature of American society. Although the American mass media may from time to time impose or promote a particular perspective on domestic public opinion in the US, there is nevertheless a deep skepticism regarding the purposes and methods of government in American political culture. This factor, in the long run, is a huge constraint on its military action overseas. However, it is the third constraint on the US that is perhaps the most important. There is only one organization in the international system that could possibly moderate the exercise of American power today, and that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The US obviously has an enormous interest in keeping the alliance of democracies that follow the market economies alive, and therefore it is possible that its allies in the NATO will be able to moderate the exercise of its hegemony. India's relationship with the US during the Cold War years. India found itself on the opposite side of the divide from the US. India's closest friendship during those years was with the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, India suddenly found itself friendless in an increasingly hostile international environment. However, these were also the years when India decided to liberalize its economy and integrate it with the global economy. This policy and India's impressive economic growth rates in recent years have made the country an attractive economic partner for a number of countries including the US. It is important that we do not lose sight of the fact that two new factors have emerged in Indus relations in recent years. These factors relate to the technological dimension and the role of the Indian-American diaspora. Indeed, these two factors are interrelated. Consider the following facts. The US absorbs about 65% of India's total exports in the software sector. 35% of the technical staff of Boeing is estimated to be of Indian origin. 300,000 Indians work in Silicon Valley. 15% of all high-tech startups are by Indian Americans. Like all other countries, India too has to decide exactly what type of relationship it wants with the US in this phase of global hegemony. The choices are not exactly easy. Within India, the debate seems to be around three possible strategies. Those Indian analysts who see international politics largely in terms of military power are fearful of the growing closeness between India and the US. They would prefer that India maintains its aloofness from Washington and focuses upon increasing its own comprehensive national power. Other analysts see the growing convergence of interests between the US and India as a historic opportunity for India. They advocate a strategy that would allow India to take advantage of its hegemony and the mutual convergences to establish the best possible options for itself. Opposing the US, they argue, is a futile strategy that will only hurt India in the long run. A third group of analysts would advocate that India should take the lead in establishing a coalition of countries from the developing world. Over time, this coalition would become more powerful and may succeed in weaning the hegemon away from its dominating ways. India-US relations are perhaps too complex to be managed by a single strategy. India needs to develop an appropriate mix of foreign policy strategies to deal with the US. How can hegemony be overcome? How long will hegemony last? How do we get beyond hegemony? These become, for obvious reasons, some of the burning questions of our time. History provides us with some fascinating clues to answer these questions. But what about the present and the future? In international politics, very few factors formally curtail the exercise of military power by any country. There is no world government like the government of a country. As we shall see in Chapter 6, international organization is not world government. Thus, international politics is politics without government. There are some rules and norms called the laws of war that restrict, but do not prohibit, war. But few states will entrust their security to international law alone. Does this mean that there is no escape from war and hegemony? In the short term, we must recognize that no single power is anywhere near balancing the US militarily. A military coalition against the US is even less likely given the differences that exist among big countries like China, India, and Russia that have the potential to challenge its hegemony. Some people argue that it is strategically more prudent to take advantage of the opportunities that hegemony creates. For instance, raising economic growth rates requires increased trade, technology transfers, and investment, which are best acquired by working with rather than against the hegemon. Thus, it is suggested that instead of engaging in activities opposed to the hegemonic power, it may be advisable to extract benefits by operating within the hegemonic system. This is called the bandwagon strategy. Another strategy open to states is to hide. This implies staying as far removed from the dominant power as possible. There are many examples of this behavior. China, Russia, the European Union, all of them, in different ways, are seeking to stay below the radar, as it were, and not overly and unduly antagonize the US. However, this would not seem to be viable for the big, second-rank powers for very long. While it may be an attractive, viable policy for small states, it is hard to imagine megastates like China, India, and Russia or huge agglomerations such as the EU being able to hide for any substantial length of time. Some people believe that resistance to American hegemony may not come from other states, which as we have seen are powerless to confront the US today, but rather from non-state actors. These challenges to American hegemony will emerge in the economic and cultural realms, and will come from a combination of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, social movements, and public opinion. It may arise from sections of the media and intellectuals, artists, and writers. These various actors may well form links across national boundaries, including with Americans, to criticize and resist as policies. You might have heard the saying that we now live in a global village. In this global village, we are all neighbors of the village headman. If the behavior of the headman becomes intolerable, we will not have the option of leaving the global village, because this is the only world we know and the only village we have. Resistance will then be the only option available. What does history teach us about hegemony? Given the logic of balance of power, hegemony is a rather unusual condition in international affairs. This is for a very simple reason: in the absence of world government, every state must ensure its own security and, in extreme circumstances, its own survival. Thus, states are acutely aware of power distribution in the international political system, and would not normally allow a single state to become so powerful as to pose a mortal threat to other states. The balance of power logic of international politics, as outlined above, is amply supported by history. By convention, we regard 1648 as the year in which the sovereign territorial state emerged as the principal actor in world politics. In the over 3.5 centuries since then, there have been only 2 previous occasions when a single state succeeded in gaining preponderance in the system to a similar degree as the US predominates the system today. France from 1660 to 1713 in the context of European continental politics in the first instance of hegemony, Britain with its global maritime empire from 1860 to 1910 is the second. History also tells us that although at its height hegemony seems formidable, it does not last forever. To the contrary, balance of power politics over time reduces the relative power of the hegemon. In 1660, France under Louis XIV was unchallenged. By 1713, England, Habsburg Austria and Russia were contesting French power. In 1860, the high noon of the Victorian period, Pax Britannica looked secure forever. By 1910, it was clear that Germany, Japan and the US had emerged as contenders to British power. Thus, 20 years from now, another great power, or maybe a coalition of great powers could well emerge just as its capabilities are declining in relative terms. Based on an article by Christopher Lane, The Unipolar Illusion, Why New Great Powers Will Rise, this picture of burned and broken vehicles was taken on the Highway of Death, a road between Kuwait and Basra, on which the retreating Iraqi army was attacked by American aircraft during the First Gulf War in February 1991. Some commentators have suggested that the US forces deliberately bombed this stretch of highway where fleeing and, out of combat, Iraqi soldiers were stuck in a frenzied traffic jam and that the victims included Kuwaiti prisoners and hostages and Palestinian civilian refugees. Many observers have called it a war crime and a violation of the Geneva Convention. Most armed forces in the world divide their areas of operation into various commands which are assigned to different commanders. This map depicts the areas of responsibility of the 5 commands of the US Armed Forces. It shows that the commands of the US military are not limited to the area of the United States, it extends to include the whole world. What does this map tell us about the military power of the US? Lok Sabha debates Indus relations. Here are 3 extracts from the speeches by the Prime Minister and 2 opposition leaders during the debate in Lok Sabha on the Indus Agreement on nuclear energy. Are these 3 positions in some way linked to the 3 strategies mentioned in the chapter? Dr. Manmohan Singh, Congress. Sir, I would respectfully urge this august House to recognize the changed mood of the world towards India. This is not to say that power politics is a thing of the past, that there will never be any attempt to twist our arms. We will protect ourselves to ensure against the risks that are there. But it would be wrong for us not to take advantage of the opportunities that are now on the horizon. I sincerely believe that it is in the interest of our country to have good relations with all the major powers. I make no apology that we seek good relations with the United States. The United States is a preeminent power. Shri Basu Debikaria, CPI-M. Since independence, we have been pursuing independent foreign policy because of our national interest. What have we seen in case of Iraq and in case of Iran? After the July statement, and when there was voting in International Atomic Energy Agency, we found that we sided with the United States of America. We supported the resolution moved by S&P 5. That was not expected before that. When we were trying to bring gas from Iran via Pakistan, which we need, we supported America's stand in regard to Iran. There we find that the independent foreign policy has been affected. Maj. Gen. RETD, B. C. Kandara, BJP. We have also to take note of the fact that today is, whether we like it or not, the only superpower in this unipolar world. But at the same time, we must also remember that India is also emerging as a world power and a superpower. Therefore, we feel that we should have good relations with the USA in the international scenario, but it should not be at the cost of our security. Chapter 4: Alternative Centers of Power. Overview. After the end of the bipolar structure of world politics in the early 1990s, it became clear that alternative centers of political and economic power could limit America's dominance. Thus, in Europe, the European Union (EU), and, in Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations (ASEAN), have emerged as forces to reckon with. While evolving regional solutions to their historical enmities and weaknesses, both the EU and the ASEAN have developed alternative institutions and conventions that build a more peaceful and cooperative regional order and have transformed the countries in the region into prosperous economies. The economic rise of China has made a dramatic impact on world politics. In this chapter, we take a look at some of these emerging alternative centers of power and assess their possible role in the future. European Union. As the Second World War came to an end, many of Europe's leaders grappled with the question of Europe. Should Europe be allowed to revert to its old rivalries or be reconstructed on principles and institutions that would contribute to a positive conception of international relations? The Second World War shattered many of the assumptions and structures on which the European states had based their relations. In 1945, the European states confronted the ruin of their economies and the destruction of the assumptions and structures on which Europe had been founded. European integration after 1945 was aided by the Cold War. America extended massive financial help for reviving Europe's economy under what was called the Marshall Plan. The US also created a new collective security structure under NATO. Under the Marshall Plan, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation (OEEC) was established in 1948 to channel aid to the West European states. It became a forum where the Western European states began to cooperate on trade and economic issues. The Council of Europe, established in 1949, was another step forward in political cooperation. The process of economic integration of European capitalist countries proceeded step by step. See Timeline of European integration, leading to the formation of the European Economic Community in 1957. This process acquired a political dimension with the creation of the European Parliament. The collapse of the Soviet bloc put Europe on a fast track and resulted in the establishment of the European Union in 1992. The foundation was thus laid for a common foreign and security policy, cooperation on justice and home affairs, and the creation of a single currency. The European Union has evolved over time from an economic union to an increasingly political one. The EU has started to act more as a nation-state. While the attempts to have a constitution for the EU have failed, it has its own flag, anthem, founding date, and currency. It also has some form of a common foreign and security policy in its dealings with other nations. The European Union has tried to expand areas of cooperation while acquiring new members, especially from the erstwhile Soviet bloc. The process has not proved easy, for people in many countries are not very enthusiastic in giving the EU powers that were exercised by the government of their country. There are also reservations about including some new countries within the EU. The EU has economic, political and diplomatic, and military influence. The EU is the world's biggest economy with a GDP of more than $12 trillion in 2005, slightly larger than that of the United States. Its currency, the euro, can pose a threat to the dominance of the US dollar. Its share of world trade is 3 times larger than that of the United States, allowing it to be more assertive in trade disputes with the US and China. Its economic power gives it influence over its closest neighbors as well as in Asia and Africa. It also functions as an important bloc in international economic organizations such as the World Trade Organization, WTO. The EU also has political and diplomatic influence. 2 members of the EU, Britain and France, hold permanent seats on the UN Security Council. The EU includes several non-permanent members of the UNSC. This has enabled the EU to influence some US policies such as the current US position on Iran's nuclear program. Its use of diplomacy, economic investments, and negotiations rather than coercion and military force has been effective, as in the case of its dialogue with China on human rights and environmental degradation. Militarily, the EU's combined armed forces are the second largest in the world. Its total spending on defense is second after the US. 2 EU member states, Britain and France, also have nuclear arsenals of approximately 550 nuclear warheads. It is also the world's second most important source of space and communications technology. As a supranational organization, the EU is able to intervene in economic, political and social areas. But in many areas its member states have their own foreign relations and defense policies that are often at odds with each other. Thus, Britain's Prime Minister Tony Blair was America's partner in the Iraq invasion, and many of the EU's newer members made up the US-led coalition of the willing, whereas Germany and France opposed American policy. There is also a deep-seated Euroscepticism in some parts of Europe about the EU's integrationist agenda. Thus, for example, Britain's former Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, kept the UK out of the European market. Denmark and Sweden have resisted the Maastricht Treaty and the adoption of the euro, the common European currency. This limits the ability of the EU to act in matters of foreign relations and defense. Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, take a look at the political map of the world. Which countries would you say fall in the southeastern region of Asia? Before and during the Second World War, this region of Asia suffered the economic and political consequences of repeated colonialisms, both European and Japanese. At the end of the war, it confronted problems of nation-building, the ravages of poverty and economic backwardness, and the pressure to align with one great power or another during the Cold War. This was a recipe for conflict, which the countries of Southeast Asia could ill afford. Efforts at Asian and Third World unity, such as the Bandung Conference and the Non-Aligned Movement, were ineffective in establishing the conventions for informal cooperation and interaction. Hence, the Southeast Asian nations sought an alternative by establishing the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. ASEAN was established in 1967 by 5 countries of this region, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore and Thailand, by signing the Bangkok Declaration. The objectives of ASEAN were primarily to accelerate economic growth and through that social progress and cultural development. A secondary objective was to promote regional peace and stability based on the rule of law and the principles of the United Nations Charter. Over the years, Brunei Darussalam, Vietnam, Laos PDR, Myanmar, Burma, and Cambodia joined ASEAN, taking its strength to 10. Unlike the EU, there is little desire in ASEAN for supranational structures and institutions. ASEAN countries have celebrated what has become known as the ASEAN Way, a form of interaction that is informal, non-confrontationist and cooperative. The respect for national sovereignty is critical to the functioning of ASEAN. With some of the fastest growing economies in the world, ASEAN broadened its objectives beyond the economic and social spheres. In 2003, ASEAN moved along the path of the EU by agreeing to establish an ASEAN community comprising 3 pillars, namely, the ASEAN Security Community, the ASEAN Economic Community and the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. The ASEAN Security Community was based on the conviction that outstanding territorial disputes should not escalate into armed confrontation. By 2003, ASEAN had several agreements in place by which member states promised to uphold peace, neutrality, cooperation, non-interference, and respect for national differences and sovereign rights. The ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF, which was established in 1994, is the organization that carries out coordination of security and foreign policy. ASEAN was and still remains principally an economic association. While the ASEAN region as a whole is a much smaller economy compared to the US, the EU, and Japan, its economy is growing much faster than all these. This accounts for the growth in its influence both in the region and beyond. The objectives of the ASEAN Economic Community are to create a common market and production base within ASEAN states and to aid social and economic development in the region. The Economic Community would also like to improve the existing ASEAN dispute settlement mechanism to resolve economic disputes. ASEAN has focused on creating a free trade area (FTA) for investment, labor, and services. The US and China have already moved fast to negotiate FTAs with ASEAN. ASEAN is rapidly growing into a very important regional organization. Its Vision 2020 has defined an outward-looking role for ASEAN in the international community. This builds on the existing ASEAN policy to encourage negotiation over conflicts in the region. Thus, ASEAN has mediated the end of the Cambodian conflict, the East Timor crisis, and meets annually to discuss East Asian cooperation. The current economic strength of ASEAN, especially its economic relevance as a trading and investment partner to the growing Asian economies such as India and China, makes this an attractive proposition. During the Cold War years, Indian foreign policy did not pay adequate attention to ASEAN. But in recent years, India has tried to make amends. It signed FTAs with 2 ASEAN members, Singapore and Thailand. It is trying to sign an FTA with ASEAN itself. ASEAN's strength, however, lies in its policies of interaction and consultation with member states, with dialogue partners, and with other non-regional organizations. It is the only regional association in Asia that provides a political forum where Asian countries and the major powers can discuss political and security concerns. The rise of the Chinese economy. Let us now turn to the third major alternative center of power in our immediate neighbor, China. The cartoon on the following page sums up the current mood all over the world about the rise of China as an economic power. China's economic success since 1978 has been linked to its rise as a great power. China has been the fastest growing economy since the reforms first began there. It is projected to overtake the US as the world's largest economy by 2040. Its economic integration into the region makes it the driver of East Asian growth, thereby giving it enormous influence in regional affairs. The strength of its economy, together with other factors such as population, land mass, resources, regional location and political influence, adds to its power in significant ways. After the inception of the People's Republic of China in 1949, following the Communist Revolution under the leadership of Mao, its economy was based on the Soviet model. The economically backward Communist China chose to sever its links with the capitalist world. It had little choice but to fall back on its own resources and, for a brief period, on Soviet aid and advice. The model was to create a state-owned heavy industries sector from the capital accumulated from agriculture. As it was short of foreign exchange that it needed in order to buy technology and goods on the world market, China decided to substitute imports by domestic goods. This model allowed China to use its resources to establish the foundations of an industrial economy on a scale that did not exist before. Employment and social welfare was assured to all citizens, and China moved ahead of most developing countries in educating its citizens and ensuring better health for them. The economy also grew at a respectable rate of 5 to 6%. But an annual growth of 2 to 3% in population meant that economic growth was insufficient to meet the needs of a growing population. Agricultural production was not sufficient to generate a surplus for industry. In Chapter 2, we discussed the crisis of the state-controlled economy in the USSR. A similar crisis was to face China too. Its industrial production was not growing fast enough, international trade was minimal and per capita income was very low. The Chinese leadership took major policy decisions in the 1970s. China ended its political and economic isolation with the establishment of relations with the United States in 1972. Premier Zhou Enlai proposed the four modernizations: agriculture, industry, science and technology and military in 1973. By 1978, the then leader Deng Xiaoping announced the open door policy and economic reforms in China. The policy was to generate higher productivity by investments of capital and technology from abroad. China followed its own path in introducing a market economy. The Chinese did not go for shock therapy, but opened their economy step by step. The privatization of agriculture in 1982 was followed by the privatization of industry in 1998. Trade barriers were eliminated only in special economic zones, SEZs, where foreign investors could set up enterprises. In China, the state played and continues to play a central role in setting up a market economy. The new economic policies helped the Chinese economy to break from stagnation. Privatization of agriculture led to a remarkable rise in agricultural production and rural incomes. High personal savings in the rural economy lead to an exponential growth in rural industry. The Chinese economy, including both industry and agriculture, grew at a faster rate. The new trading laws and the creation of special economic zones led to a phenomenal rise in foreign trade. China has become the most important destination for foreign direct investment, FDI, anywhere in the world. It has large foreign exchange reserves that now allow it to make big investment in other countries. China's accession to the WTO in 2001 has been a further step in its opening to the outside world. The country plans to deepen its integration into the world economy and shape the future world economic order. While the Chinese economy has improved dramatically, not everyone in China has received the benefits of the reforms. Unemployment has risen in China with nearly 100 million people looking for jobs. Female employment and conditions of work are as bad as in Europe of the 18th and 19th centuries. Environmental degradation and corruption have increased besides a rise in economic inequality between rural and urban residents and coastal and inland provinces. However, regionally and globally, China has become an economic power to reckon with. The integration of China's economy and the interdependencies that this has created has enabled China to have considerable influence with its trade partners. Hence, its outstanding issues with Japan, the US, ASEAN, and Russia have been tempered by economic considerations. It hopes to resolve its differences with Taiwan, which it regards as a renegade province, by integrating it closely into its economy. Fears of China's rise have also been mitigated by its contributions to the stability of the ASEAN economies after the 1997 financial crisis. Its more outward-looking investment and aid policies in Latin America and Africa are increasingly projecting it as a global player on the side of developing economies. India-China relations. India and China were great powers in Asia before the advent of Western imperialism. China had considerable influence and control on the periphery of its borders based on its unique tributary system. At different times in China's long history of dynastic rule, Mongolia, Korea, parts of Indochina, and Tibet accepted China's authority. Various kingdoms and empires in India also extended their influence beyond their borders. In both cases, this influence was political, economic, and cultural. However, the regions where India and China exercised influence rarely ever overlapped. Thus, there was limited political and cultural interaction between the two. The result was that neither country was very familiar with the other. In the 20th century, when both nations confronted each other, they had some difficulty evolving a foreign policy to deal with each other. After India regained its independence from Britain, and China expelled the foreign powers, there was hope that both would come together to shape the future of the developing world and of Asia particularly. For a brief while, the slogan of "Hindukini Bye-bye" was popular. However, military conflict over a border dispute between the two countries marred that hope. Soon after independence, both states were involved in differences arising from the Chinese takeover of Tibet in 1950 and the final settlement of the Sino-Indian border. China and India were involved in a border conflict in 1962 over competing territorial claims, principally in Arunachal Pradesh and in the Aksai-Chin region of Ladakh. The conflict of 1962, in which India suffered military reverses, had long-term implications for India-China relations. Diplomatic relations between the two countries were downgraded until 1976. Thereafter, relations between the two countries began to improve slowly. After the change in China's political leadership from the mid to late 1970s, China's policy became more pragmatic and less ideological. So it was prepared to put off the settlement of contentious issues while improving relations with India. A series of talks to resolve the border issue were also initiated in 1981. Since the end of the Cold War, there have been significant changes in India-China relations. Their relations now have a strategic as well as an economic dimension. Both view themselves as rising powers in global politics, and both would like to play a major role in the Asian economy and politics. Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China in December 1988 provided the impetus for an improvement in India-China relations. Since then, both governments have taken measures to contain conflict and maintain peace and tranquility on the border. They have also signed agreements on cultural exchanges and cooperation in science and technology, and opened 4 border posts for trade. With India-China trade growing at 30% per year since 1999, a more positive perspective on relations with China has emerged. Bilateral trade between India and China has increased from $338 million in 1992 to more than $18 billion in 2006. More recently, both countries have agreed to cooperate with each other in areas that could otherwise create conflict between the two, such as bidding for energy deals abroad. At the global level, India and China have adopted similar policies in international economic institutions like the World Trade Organization. India's nuclear tests in 1998, sometimes justified on the grounds of a threat from China, did not stop greater interaction. It is true that China was seen as contributing to the build-up of Pakistan's nuclear program. China's military relations with Bangladesh and Myanmar were viewed as hostile to Indian interests in South Asia. However, none of these issues is likely to lead to conflict between the two. One sign of this is that the talks to resolve the boundary question have continued without interruption and military-to-military cooperation is increasing. Indian and Chinese leaders and officials visit Beijing and New Delhi with greater frequency, and both sides are now becoming more familiar with each other. Increasing transportation and communication links, common economic interests and global concerns should help establish a more positive and sound relationship between the two most populous countries of the world. Japan. You might have heard about famous Japanese brands such as Sony, Panasonic, Canon, Suzuki, Honda, Toyota, Mazda. They have a reputation for making high-technology products. Japan has very few natural resources and imports most of its raw materials. Even then, it progressed rapidly after the end of the Second World War. It is the second largest economy in the world. It is the only Asian member of the G8. It is the 10th most populous nation in the world. Japan is the only nation that suffered the destruction caused by nuclear bombs. It is the second largest contributor to the regular budget of the UN, contributing almost 20% of the total. Japan has a security alliance with the US since 1951. As per Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. Although Japan's military expenditure is only 1% of its GDP, it is the fourth largest in the world. Keeping all this in mind, do you think Japan can effectively function as an alternative center of power? Also find out about the agreement signed during the visit of the Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to Japan during December 2006. Timeline of European integration: 1951 April, 6 West European countries, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg sign the Treaty of Paris establishing the European Coal and Steel Community (ECSC). 1957 March 25, these 6 countries sign the Treaties of Rome establishing the European Economic Community (EEC) and the European Atomic Energy Community (Euratom). 1973 January, Denmark, Ireland and the United Kingdom join the European Community (EC). 1979 June, first direct elections to the European Parliament. 1981 January, Greece joins the EC. 1985 June, the Schengen Agreement abolishes border controls among the EC members. 1986 January, Spain and Portugal join the EC. 1990 October, unification of Germany. 1992 February 7, the Treaty of Maastricht was signed establishing the European Union (EU). 1993 January, the single market was created. 1995 January, Austria, Finland and Sweden join the EU. 2002 January, Euro, the new currency, was introduced in the 12 EU members. 2004 May, 10 new members, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia and Slovenia join the EU. 2007 January, Bulgaria and Romania join the EU. Slovenia adopts the euro. Chapter: Contemporary South Asia. Overview. Let us shift our gaze from the larger global developments in the post-Cold War era to developments in our own region, South Asia. When India and Pakistan joined the club of nuclear powers, this region suddenly became the focus of global attention. The focus was, of course, on the various kinds of conflict in this region. There are pending border and water-sharing disputes between the states of the region. Besides, there are conflicts arising out of insurgency, ethnic strife and resource sharing. This makes the region very turbulent. At the same time, many people in South Asia recognize the fact that this region can develop and prosper if the states of the region cooperate with each other. In this chapter, we try to understand the nature of conflict and cooperation among different countries of the region. Since much of this is rooted in or conditioned by the domestic politics of these countries, we first introduce the region and the domestic politics of some of the big countries in the region. What is South Asia? We are all familiar with the gripping tension during an India-Pakistan cricket match. We have also seen the goodwill and hospitality shown to visiting Indian and Pakistani fans by their hosts when they come to watch a cricket match. This is symbolic of the larger pattern of South Asian affairs. Ours is a region where rivalry and goodwill, hope and despair, mutual suspicion and trust coexist. Let us begin by asking an elementary question: what is South Asia? The expression South Asia usually includes the following countries: Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. The mighty Himalayas in the north and the vast Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal in the south, west and east respectively provide a natural insularity to the region, which is largely responsible for the linguistic, social and cultural distinctiveness of the subcontinent. The boundaries of the region are not as clear in the east and the west, as they are in the north and the south. Afghanistan and Myanmar are often included in discussions of the region as a whole. China is an important player but is not considered to be a part of the region. In this chapter, we shall use South Asia to mean the 7 countries mentioned above. Thus defined, South Asia stands for diversity in every sense and yet constitutes one geopolitical space. The various countries in South Asia do not have the same kind of political systems. Despite many problems and limitations, Sri Lanka and India have successfully operated a democratic system since their independence from the British. You will study more about the evolution of democracy in India in the textbook that deals with politics in India since independence. It is, of course, possible to point out many limitations of India's democracy, but we have to remember the fact that India has remained a democracy throughout its existence as an independent country. The same is true of Sri Lanka. Pakistan and Bangladesh have experienced both civilian and military rulers, with Bangladesh remaining a democracy in the post-Cold War period. Pakistan began the post-Cold War period with successive democratic governments under Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif respectively. But it suffered a military coup in 1999 and has been run by a military regime since then. Till 2006, Nepal was a constitutional monarchy with the danger of the king taking over executive powers. In 2006, a successful popular uprising led to the restoration of democracy and reduced the king to a nominal position. From the experience of Bangladesh and Nepal, we can say that democracy is becoming an accepted norm in the entire region of South Asia. Similar changes are taking place in the 2 smallest countries of the region. Bhutan is still a monarchy, but the king has initiated plans for its transition to multi-party democracy. The Maldives, the other island nation, was a sultanate till 1968 when it was transformed into a republic with a presidential form of government. In June 2005, the Parliament of the Maldives voted unanimously to introduce a multi-party system. The Maldivian Democratic Party (MDP) dominates the political affairs of the island. Democracy strengthened in the Maldives after the 2005 elections when some opposition parties were legalized. Despite the mixed record of the democratic experience, the people in all these countries share the aspiration for democracy. A recent survey of the attitudes of the people in the 5 big countries of the region showed that there is widespread support for democracy in all these countries. Ordinary citizens, rich as well as poor and belonging to different religions, view the idea of democracy positively and support the institutions of representative democracy. They prefer democracy over any other form of democracy and think that democracy is suitable for their country. These are significant findings, for it was earlier believed that democracy could flourish and find support only in prosperous countries of the world. People's Party, and the Muslim League. This phase of elective democracy lasted till 1999 when the army stepped in again and General Pervez Musharraf removed Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. In 2001, General Musharraf got himself elected as the president. Pakistan continues to be ruled by the army, though the army rulers have held some elections to give their rule a democratic image. Several factors have contributed to Pakistan's failure in building a stable democracy. The social dominance of the military, clergy, and landowning aristocracy has led to the frequent overthrow of elected governments and the establishment of military government. Pakistan's conflict with India has made the pro-military groups more powerful. These groups have often said that political parties and democracy in Pakistan are flawed, that Pakistan's security would be harmed by selfish-minded parties and chaotic democracy, and that the army's stay in power is, therefore, justified. While democracy has not been fully successful in Pakistan, there has been a strong pro-democracy sentiment in the country. Pakistan has a courageous and relatively free press and a strong human rights movement. The lack of genuine international support for democratic rule in Pakistan has further encouraged the military to continue its dominance. The United States and other Western countries have encouraged the military's authoritarian rule in the past, for their own reasons. Given their fear of the threat of what they call global Islamic terrorism and the apprehension that Pakistan's nuclear arsenal might fall into the hands of these terrorist groups, the military regime in Pakistan has been seen as the protector of Western interests in West Asia and South Asia. Democracy in Bangladesh. Bangladesh was a part of Pakistan from 1947 to 1971. It consisted of the partitioned areas of Bengal and Assam from British India. The people of this region resented the domination of Western Pakistan and the imposition of the Urdu language. Soon after the partition, they began protests against the unfair treatment meted out to the Bengali culture and language. They also demanded fair representation in administration and a fair share in political power. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman led the popular struggle against West Pakistani domination. He demanded autonomy for the eastern region. In the 1970 elections in the then Pakistan, the Awami League led by Sheikh Mujib won all the seats in East Pakistan and secured a majority in the proposed Constituent Assembly for the whole of Pakistan. But the government dominated by the West Pakistani leadership refused to convene the assembly. Sheikh Mujib was arrested. Under the military rule of General Yahya Khan, the Pakistani army tried to suppress the mass movement of the Bengali people. Thousands were killed by the Pakistan army. This led to a large-scale migration into India, creating a huge refugee problem for India. The government of India supported the demand of the people of East Pakistan for their independence and helped them financially and militarily. This resulted in a war between India and Pakistan in December 1971 that ended in the surrender of the Pakistani forces in East Pakistan and the formation of Bangladesh as an independent country. Bangladesh drafted its constitution declaring faith in secularism, democracy and socialism. However, in 1975 Sheikh Mujib got the constitution amended to shift from the parliamentary to presidential form of government. He also abolished all parties except his own, the Awami League. This led to conflicts and tensions. In a dramatic and tragic development, he was assassinated in a military uprising in August 1975. The new military ruler, Ziaur Rahman, formed his own Bangladesh National Party and won elections in 1979. He was assassinated and another military takeover followed under the leadership of Lt Gen H.M. Ershad. The people of Bangladesh soon rose in support of the demand for democracy. Students were in the forefront. Ershad was forced to allow political activity on a limited scale. He was later elected as president for 5 years. Mass public protests made Ershad step down in 1990. Elections were held in 1991. Since then, representative democracy based on multi-party elections has been working in Bangladesh. Monarchy and democracy in Nepal. Nepal was a Hindu kingdom in the past and then a constitutional monarchy in the modern period for many years. Throughout this period, political parties and the common people of Nepal have wanted a more open and responsive system of government. but the king, with the help of the army, retained full control over the government and restricted the expansion of democracy in Nepal. The king accepted the demand for a new democratic constitution in 1990, in the wake of a strong pro-democracy movement. However, democratic governments had a short and troubled career. During the 90s, the Maoists of Nepal were successful in spreading their influence in many parts of Nepal. They believed in armed insurrection against the monarch and the ruling elite. This led to a violent conflict between the Maoist guerrillas and the armed forces of the king. For some time, there was a triangular conflict among the monarchist forces, the Democrats and the Maoists. In 2002, the king abolished the parliament and dismissed the government, thus ending even the limited democracy that existed in Nepal. In April 2006, there were massive, countrywide, pro-democracy protests. The struggling pro-democracy forces achieved their first major victory when the king was forced to restore the House of Representatives that had been dissolved in April 2002. The largely non-violent movement was led by the Seven-Party Alliance (SPA), the Maoists and social activists. Nepal's